And from there, of course, I went to Worcester College, and I spent a year there in the Department of Religion and Philosophy, and from there to Colgate University in New York. Spent 2 years there in the Department of Religion and Philosophy. 1984, I came to Vanderbilt, the fall of '84, and I spent 29.5 years teaching in the Religious Studies Department at Vanderbilt. For some 40 years now, I've been involved in King Scholarship, scholarship on the life, thought, and activities of Martin Luther King, Jr. I've written about 6 books on Dr. King, edited 2, co-edited 2, co-authored 2, for a total of 12 books. So for the last 40 years, I've been involved in Martin Luther King Jr. scholarship.
You are, in a real sense, Dr. Martin Luther King, reincarnated, or
Thank
whatever,
you.
etc.
Thank you.
Dr. Baldwin, let's talk about the Confederate monuments. That is to sort of lay down the topic for the first 2 minutes of next 2 minutes before we have our second commercial break.
Okay.
And remind our audience that you also talked about the Confederacy itself and the Confederate Constitution, et cetera. Pull that information in when you talk about those monuments.
Yes, the last time I was here, I talked about the Confederate flag and the debate swirling around
and bring all
the
of that
Confederate flag.
in.
But now, since August the 12th, and I think you remember that date, the violent confrontation in Charlottesville, Virginia, between neo-Nazis, Klansmen, and counter-protesters. And I think that encounter on August 12th, 2017, actually triggered this debate around Confederate monuments. And we have to understand the history of those monuments. Right after the Civil War ended in 1865, there was really no attempt to engage in a massive campaign for the erection of these kinds of monuments. In fact, most of them were erected between the 1890s and the 1960s. The 1890s, you have the black codes, Jim Crow laws being put into place. And of course, there was a reaction to that, keeping blacks from voting, that kind of thing. So you get, from the 1890s on, the erection of Confederate monuments. Through the 1920s with the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. And we don't see these monuments being erected on a mass scale after that time until the 1950s and 60s when the Civil Rights Movement started. And of course, it occurred as a backlash to what was going on with Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement. So since August 12th of this year, we've had this debate since the events in Charlottesville about whether or not these monuments should be dismantled, put into historical museums. There are all kinds of questions about whether or not they should exist.
Okay, so let's take this first commercial break, and then we'll come back and pick up. And we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Thank you, and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Louis Baldwin, and the topic is Confederate monuments. And so, Doctor, let's start at the beginning and give you an opportunity to start now to talk about the origin of these monuments and et cetera and et cetera.
Okay, now these monuments originated to really celebrate the Confederacy, to celebrate Confederate leaders like Robert E. Lee, Confederate generals, Confederate soldiers, Confederate states. And as you well know, there were 11 states that broke with the Union. So these monuments emerged primarily to celebrate people like Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee and others. They also emerged as a kind of white backlash to civil rights activities, initiatives, etc. So the argument today, of course, the arguments, I think, run along two lines. First of all, those who are in favor of the preservation of these monuments argue that they represent history. They represent the culture of the past. They represent Southern pride. Because if you look at the location of these monuments, most of them are in the South. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, some 1,500 of these monuments exist today, and that includes statues, that includes schools and parks and other institutions named after Confederate soldiers, Confederate leaders. They represent a celebration of certain Confederate states, and most of them are in Virginia and North Carolina and Georgia. But there are some 1,500 of them, and 700 of that 1,500 are actually statues that stand as memorials to people who were involved in the Confederacy. But the argument, I think, is that they represent history, they represent heritage, they represent the culture of the past, but then you have those who are opposed to these monuments who say that they actually represent white supremacy. I remember reading Dr. King's book, Where Do We Go From Here? And he talks about how they represent a kind of master race ethos. There's also the argument that they celebrate slavery and segregation, that they divide the nation. And I think that's the most important argument because, as you well know, we are very much divided as a nation today. So these monuments, the debate that started August 12th with the Charlottesville events, which involved the murder of Heather Heyer, who was killed by one of these neo-Nazis. That debate has gone on, and I think it's reached fever pitch since that time. So the whole question is, where do we go from here?
And now these monuments, not only do they stand alone, I think you've indicated that, but you also find small statuettes of them located. And there's something in Tennessee. What about the state of Tennessee when we think about these monuments?
If you look at Tennessee, I was reading recently an article about Knoxville. You don't find a lot of monuments in Knoxville because we have to understand that East Tennessee remained part of the Union.
Okay.
It didn't separate from the Union. So you don't find a lot of these monuments in the eastern part of Tennessee. But they are in Tennessee, in the state capitol. You have Nathan Bedford Forrest. There's been a lot of debate recently. I think the Black Caucus in the state legislature has called for the removal of Nathan Bedford Forrest's bust from the state capitol. And of course, the Metro Council has put out a statement against white supremacy. Certain churches, even the Southern Baptist Convention, has put out a statement against white supremacy. So this debate has spilled over, obviously, into Tennessee. And you have the same scenario that you have in other parts of the country with people who stand for these monuments and people who stand against them.
And it's almost like the Confederate flag. You just can't get away from it.
Exactly. The Confederate flag is very much a part of this debate because it too stands as a symbol of the Confederacy. But my problem is this: the Confederacy died. It was an attempt to establish a separate political nation, and it fizzled out. It didn't succeed. With the defeat of the Confederacy in April 1865 and the surrender of Robert E. Lee to Ulysses S. Grant and the Union forces, we know that the Confederacy died. So why are we celebrating it? The Confederacy was an attempt to divide the United States, not unite us. And I think as long as these monuments stand, these statues, parks and schools and churches and other institutions named after Confederate generals and leaders and soldiers, as long as these monuments stand, they will divide Americans.
You know, the last time you were here, we talked about the Confederate flag. And I think one of the things that you mentioned was that Robert E. Lee probably did not agree with some of the thoughts in reference to bringing that flag out and using that flag. What do you think that he would have thought of himself being the subject of one of these large monuments in the park like it was in Virginia?
I don't think Robert E. Lee, especially toward the end of his life, you read, thought in terms of dividing Americans. I think he had some regrets about what happened in terms of the Confederacy and its rebellion against the United States. So it's hard to say what he would think today, but I think he would be rather disturbed because he is viewed with a mixture of praise and disdain. There are those who praise and celebrate him, and there are those who reject his image and who feel that he represented something very dark, to put it that way, in our history. So, you know, not only Robert E. Lee, but others who were involved, Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, so many others. One wonders what they would think about this controversy, about this debate going on today around Confederate monuments.
You mentioned the number in terms, say that again in reference to how prevalent these are throughout the nation.
Yes, well, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, there are roughly 1,500 monuments, statues, streets named after Confederate leaders, etc. But 700 of those are actually statues.
Statues themselves.
They're statues themselves. And I always think, is it possible for us to actually get rid of these? I don't think so.
I don't think so either, because they're so prevalent.
Yes, I think
so much opposition.
There will always be these symbols. In parts of Alabama, certain towns have vowed to not only hold on to the Confederate monuments they have, but to create others.
Very good.
So
let me take this second commercial break, Dr. Baldwin. We'll be back. And we'll be back with our audience following this second commercial break. Thank you and welcome back to the final segment of the show for today. We're talking to Dr. Lewis Baldwin, and he's giving us some information relative to Confederate monuments. Doctor, let's see if we can pick up during this last 10 minutes in terms of these monuments and any related kind of information that you think that our audience ought to be familiar with.
Yes, I think one of the important things that we should look at today is where our political leadership at the national level, the regional level, and the local level, where are they standing around this question of Confederate monuments? We see at the national level, the politics feeds into this kind of white nationalism that has developed since the election of Donald Trump to the presidency. And I think there are forces within the white nationalist movement who are devoted to the preservation of these monuments. There are counter movements developing around the country, thank God. I think Lamar Alexander, the senator from Tennessee, has said that Nathan Bedford Forrest's bust should not be in the state capitol. So there are hopeful signs with some of our politicians, but my problem is looking at the national level, at the president and some of our congressional leaders and leaders in the House of Representatives, many of whom have been silent on this issue. And the president, of course, has argued that if you get rid of them, you're getting rid of history. So the question is, are we trying to unite the nation, or do we want to cause more and more divisions? You know, there are already questions about immigration and other issues confronting us, health care, etc. But I think this debate over monuments will continue. I don't think it will end. I think churches need to get involved and make a statement. Not only politicians, but churches. Educational institutions need to get involved. Professors, religious leaders need to get involved, because this is a very serious issue. And if we're not careful, and it's not just the South, I want to point that out. In New York, in California,
they've got.
there have been a few Confederate monuments. People drive around with Confederate flags on their car tags. So we're talking about a national issue. Most of the monuments now exist in the South. The vast majority of Confederate monuments, and understandably so, exist in the South. But the debate has carried...
And the sentiment is everywhere else.
Yeah, the debate has extended into New York and California and Ohio and states that we don't normally think of when we talk about Confederate monuments.
Nor do you think that they are Confederate states.
Exactly,
you know,
they're not Confederate states.
That's what I mean. It's odd that California and that New York would have a Confederate monument yeah, well, I guess.
But they're not Confederate states, and it's a national issue. So many want to make it a southern, a regional issue, but it's not that. I think we have to view it as a national issue and treat it as that, and take that into account as we debate these issues.
And so this would be an issue along with the flag. I think that you also indicated at one time.
But the flag is not being talked about a lot now. There was some debate over it after Dylann Roof committed those murders in Charleston. The Charleston 9 was murdered because he was shown with a picture of the Confederate flag. At that point, the Confederate flag became an issue, but I think it's a much larger issue now of what the Confederacy was all about, and should we celebrate it in any way? So those are the questions today. So it extends beyond the Confederate. The Confederate flag is still important, but it extends beyond that to take into account the numerous Confederate monuments and statues that exist around in the South primarily, and in other parts of the country.
And so the attitude in reference to some of the states is that these monuments can exist on private property, but they ought not to exist on state property.
Yes, and we have to keep in mind now that some states have in place legal mechanisms to prevent the removal of these monuments. Tennessee, for an example, you have to work through a historical commission.
Okay.
Two-thirds of the votes in the historical commission are required to do what? To move a monument. In South Carolina, two-thirds of the state legislature have to vote in favor of the removal. In
other words, it would be almost impossible to think about them being removed in South Carolina if we follow that prescription.
Right. The state legislature has to vote in favor of it. Tennessee, you're working with historical commissions, and there are other states like Alabama and Georgia that have in place these legal mechanisms that makes it virtually impossible for you to remove these monuments.
Now, what about the Daughters of the Confederacy? I think that organization has played a significant role, not only in terms of the flag, but speak to
the Daughters of the Confederacy, the Sons of the Confederacy, you have Confederate Veterans Organizations. All of these institutions that have existed since the late 19th century, early 20th century, have not been very vocal so far, but we know where they stand on these monuments because they are a part of this legacy.
And they've got the key
of the Confederacy.
They don't too much worry about what we say because they've got the key.
They have not triggered this debate. The neo-Nazis and Klansmen in Charlottesville, they are the ones who have triggered this national debate about Confederate monuments. But we know in the background there are always these Daughters of the Confederacy, and I know about them because having taught at Vanderbilt for 29 and a half years, I know they had Confederate Hall there, and there was always this debate about what to do about that.
I was there when that now that hall was removed, was it not?
No, I don't think.
Was it the name change that they wanted on the hall, or what?
Well, they wanted a name change. They engaged in a legal battle with the Daughters of the Confederacy, and I think the name of the hall has been changed. I think, but I need to check that. Yeah, but there was a lot of debate about that.
I remember that. That
Yeah,
was long.
and when I left there in 2013, there had been no change.
And so, also there's the MTSU with the founder of Nathaniel Forrest.
Forrest,
Forrest,
Bedford Hall at MTSU. There's debate going on about that. I mean,
now the only way those could be changed would have to go through a commission. Is that what
I mean, in Tennessee, as I understand it, historical commissions are prominent, and it takes a 2/3 vote working through those commissions to remove monuments, and it differs from state to state. If you look throughout the South, but most of the southern states, as I understand it, have these legal mechanisms in place, which makes it virtually impossible for you to remove these monuments. They are viewed as a part of history, they're viewed as a part of heritage, as a part of the of Southern pride.
We'll say something about the monument in Georgia on Stone Mountain.